And since one of these three forces, the Nazis, was destroyed, things were much easier after the Second World War. In 1945, very quickly something developed which came to be known as the bipolar world. The American empire on one side, the Soviet empire on the other side. The Americans understood if we attack the Russians first, we die second, and vice versa. Luckily, there was a third world where lots of proxy wars could be fought over influence in these third world countries, largely former colonies. Moving into 1968, where the Cold War, the arms race and the mobilization on the home front seemed to be completely blown away. This dense atmosphere I was just referring to, like if you're a civil rights activist, they charge you to be on the payroll of the Russians, and some people were literally charged and were sent to jail, but it couldn't stop the civil rights movement. And the same fears that had kept progressive movements under control in the 50s, in the early 60s, by the late 60s all over the world. The Cold War, objectively, in terms of having an arms race, it was still there, and the threat of nuclear meltdown was still there, but the fears were gone. Hope was reigning all over the world. Just three symbols for this, talking about the first, the second, and the third world. The symbol of hope in the first world, Paris, May 1968. A student rebellion. Well, that happens. But not just that. A general strike. Workers going on strike. The government considering to maybe go into retreat and leave the country. It didn't work out that way, but in May 1968, Paris was a sign of hope. So was Prague, the very same year, the famous Prague Spring, starting under the promise or with the promise of creating socialism with a human face. Nobody had expected this, as Ronald Reagan would later have it, empire of evil, seeing people trying to build socialism with a human face. We'll never know whether they would have been successful, whether they could have been successful, because they were crushed. But in the year 1968, Prague was a sign of hope. And so was Vietnam. 1968 saw the Tet Offensive, the Vietnamese Liberation Front starting a large-scale offensive against the imperialist forces of the United States and its allies. Militarily, it was crushed, but people around the world clearly saw the writing on the wall. And the writing on the wall in 1968 said, "The spirit of 1918 is here again. Revolution was in the air." However, it wasn't quite the same revolution as in 1918, or 1917 for that matter. Because those revolutions, 1917, 1918, 1919, they happened after devastating wars. And with those devastating wars came starvation, desperation, economic disintegration, social disintegration. In the first world, in 1968, nothing of that sort. Yeah, there were economic problems, there were social problems, but the revolution of 1968, if you want to call it a revolution in the first place, happened while unprecedented phase of economic growth was still in full swing. There was full employment. There was expansion of a welfare state. There were rising real wages. Those were the economic conditions under which there was a revolution in 1968. And actually, also the Soviet Empire had seen unprecedented economic growth. Large-scale starvation, poverty in Eastern Europe, that was gone. That was not what made people taking it to the streets. It was not the starvation in their tummy. It was about liberation. Libertarian values were high on the agenda. So there are lots of things we'll never know. not just will we never know whether the Prague Spring had a chance to build socialism with a human face, we also will never know whether national liberation movements would have been able to build a prosperous, socially just society, economy without oppression and exploitation. At this point, we are at a situation where first we had hope, 1968, and very quickly the hope was gone again. The Prague Spring was crushed. Hopes in the Third World were destroyed. Yes, in 1975, the Americans withdrew from Vietnam and the Vietnamese people gained national independence. But 2 years earlier, something else happened. On a different continent, a new front of imperialism was opened. In September 1973, a US-backed coup in Chile, which then had a democratically elected socialist government. That government was toppled, of course in the name of freedom, liberty, and democracy. A military dictatorship was installed, and a new economic program was first implemented. The economic program which later became to be known as neoliberalism. Free markets, low taxes, no state, just markets sort of thing. It first happened in Chile, and it was the military that gave birth to this baby. But neoliberalism didn't stop in Chile and other third world countries. It also saw the light in the first world. And the left in the first world wasn't prepared to stop it. The old left in the first world, social democratic parties, unions, they were so happy with welfare capitalism after the Second World War. They were so used to welfare state expansion, to collective bargaining, to grievance procedures. They thought bosses would always shake hands with them, would always be nice to them, and would always reach an agreement with them. And couldn't understand the world when all of a sudden the bosses talked tough to union leaders and social democrats. And because they pretty much had forgotten how to fight, large victories could be won on the front of rolling back the welfare state. So on all fronts, neoliberalism was on the march, marching forward, rolling back the attempts in the third world to build their economies after political liberation, rolling back the welfare states in the West, and waging a second Cold War against the Soviet Union. And this time, the Soviets had enough. In 1989, the GDR leadership decided people desperately want to get out of here, and we opened the Berlin Wall. And that actually started a kind of chain reaction from November 1989 till 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Within 2 years, a whole empire collapsed. We lived in a new world order. The rivalries between big powers, American empire, Soviet empire, it was gone. We truly lived in a new world order, so they said. Woodrow Wilson's vision became true. Only minor problems were still around. Instead of the competition between great powers, there were just these drug traffickers, terrorist networks, warlords, and failed states. But come on, let's face it. They are weak enemies. Should be fairly easy to get them under control. And not just that, it's our responsibility. We, the Free West, have to bring freedom, democracy, and prosperity to those territories where you have warlords, terrorist networks, drug traffickers. It's a responsibility. And something was invented you wouldn't have thought of until the Soviet Union disintegrated. All of a sudden, imperialism became a good thing. Until 1991, if you talked about imperialism, you were clearly identified as a lefty, as somebody who couldn't accept the virtues of the free world. After that, increasingly, in journals like Foreign Affairs, this is where the US ruling class discusses its next war efforts, you would find articles, and a number of similar publications, you would find articles saying, we need liberal imperialism. Because there are people who are not safe for democracy. Woodrow Wilson, again, was one of his slogans. We make the world safe for democracy. Well, 80 years later, not all the world was safe for democracy, but we can make it safe for that. And this is where humanitarian intervention was born. It's a real burden for us to engage in those wars against failed states. It's a burden. It's a white man's burden. That's what Rudyard Kipling had to say about this thing. The famous British writer who more than a century ago had written an infamous poem called The White Man's Burden, saying how it's a burden for us white men to spread civilization around the world. Well, there was just a linguistic update from the white man's burden to humanitarian intervention. The idea was pretty much the same. And the idea was backed by two things, by Pentagon and by Wall Street. Behind the New World Order, we find something I would call Pentagon Wall Street capitalism. Pentagon is obviously a symbol for global military might of the United States of America and its allies. Let it never be forgotten that all the dirty things the American army is doing, it only can do because it has support from your country, if you consider it your country, Canada, from something I'm supposed to consider my country, Germany, and from all its other NATO allies. And of course, Wall Street is the heart of the circulation. The US dollar is the blood circulating through the world economy, and Wall Street has the task to pump this blood through the veins of the world economy. And actually, it looks like the world is going full circle. 100 years ago, the British Empire was in decline, and only because it was in decline we had a First World War, because only a declining empire gives an appetite to rising powers. At the time, those were the Germans and the Americans. They wanted to take over the British Empire. The Germans obviously failed. The Americans, quite a while later, succeeded, and now the American Empire is in decline. What can we learn from this? Well, Woodrow Wilson's vision of liberal internationalism, yes, it became true eventually, but when it became true, it was a nightmare. And we are still living in this nightmare. Where are we going from here? I don't know. But as I already said in my introduction, it's not my intention to tell you where to go in the first place. All I try to do is to give you an idea where we are at, and if we still have some time for discussion left right now, and in many other events we are planning for the future, we should engage in the collective discussion to define where we want to go from here and how we will be able to get there. Thank you very much.
One of the federal categories on nellpolling.ca is foreign policy. When you click on this topic, several subtopics appear. The first one is Afghanistan.
Here you have several opinions, which you can agree or disagree with. Or if you are a registered participant, you can add your own choice. because new information may make you change your opinion on some social issues. Neopolling.ca enables you to change your vote when you change your mind. And that is what perpetual direct democracy is all about.
This is what we have.